does anybody know what one project would make the most immediate impact on traffic in Southern California? Most immediate impact the day it opened. If the mayor's here, say the subway, it'll make him happy. But and that's big, obviously. But the one project, 710 gap closure in Pasadena. 710 gap closure in Pasadena is because you can't get east or southeast of downtown LA unless you go through the 4 level in downtown LA. The 710, except for the 210 going all the way around, but the 710 gap closure, the day it opens, and maybe only that day, it takes 20% of the traffic out of downtown Los Angeles because you can go around it. Truck traffic can go around it. You can skip the 4 level. And what that does, if you drive in on the Santa Monica, you drive in the Hollywood, the backup doesn't start on the west side or the West Valley. It starts downtown and goes out. If you take 20% of the traffic out of the 4 level, the 101 and the 405 is a much better intersection. The 10 and the 110 is a much better intersection. Not sure anything helps the 405 and the 10, but it's a way to spread out the commute and in a way that makes sense. And I use these examples as the challenges that we're facing because based on the history of the 710 gap closure, we'll be lucky if my 3-year-old son can take advantage of that gap closure when he's able to drive. So we have challenges before us, all of which makes Measure R so more remarkable.
I can tell you, when I went to Bogota a number of years ago, I found certain things disconcerting about it. You can actually go to the green fields outside of Bogota where there's nothing but cows and find absolutely world-class Danish bikeways. Kind of a half-kilometer sector that goes nowhere. And then you go into the city and there's squalor and poverty and all those issues, and sort of what's wrong with this picture. And it was the model that it was partly kind of imprinting behavior that we have to create a bike culture, and the way to do that is to simply build everywhere these bikeways. But even though Peñalosa and this group get a lot of platitudes and accolades in this country, if you go to Bogota, there's a lot more criticism of both that program and so forth. So, in fairness, I think Bogota, like a lot of places, have some great examples, but in certain ways there have been excesses and probably not the best use of scarce resources. And but they've been successful. They've stopped the brain drain. There is, one of the strongest stock markets in the last 3 years. The economy is growing. So they do attribute it partly to creating better urbanism, less congestion, better linkages between infrastructure and urban development patterns. So, in that sense, you have to give them credit. Look, and there's some great examples you can find in Scandinavia where they do this all very well, sustainable urbanism. And a place like Stockholm, very wealthy, high-quality place, and people own cars, but they make much more judicious selective use of cars. I mean, people will drive cars for weekend excursions, big shopping volumes, they'll go to Costco or whatever. But the daily grind of going to work, a lot of people take public transit, so you find much more judicious selective use. They're a democratic system, but they're a legacy of social democracy. They're a heritage of largely public provision of education, healthcare, housing, a lot of services. It's a totally different model. I would say pretty much a generalization is all places that have more efficient, sustainable urbanism have less free input and public choice. A lot of it is more on sort of a more centralized model of planning. So let's face it, you might in certain ways enhance the public interest, but something gives. And there's somewhat of a loss of personal choice and freedoms and liberty. And where exactly we should stand in the spectrum, I mean, that's why in many ways I turn to sort of these notions of market principles, understanding though that there has to be a public sector role. There are things called externalities, there's negative spillovers, and finding that right balance. And some of these cities I've cited, I think, are doing that. It's not so much you don't have public input, but ultimately someone has the final decision, and they're perhaps not as accountable in 2-year election cycles for that decision. So, the short of it is there's a bit of a loss of democracy in urban decision making.
Let me just close with a somewhat different take on that question, in the sense that Jaime Lerner, the mayor of Curitiba, of course Brazil is no longer a military dictatorship, and he continues to be very influential. I think he became governor of the state after that. As people have gone back and studied what actually happened, he still had to form coalitions among many constituencies in the higher levels of government and lower levels of government. So there was still a lot of interaction, and this is something we see also in China and other countries that are slowly improving local accountability for these public decisions, that they're moving in that direction. And often, again, it takes very capable entrepreneurs and political positions to do this, but it's probably, we shouldn't exaggerate how hard it was for him to accomplish what he did in Curitiba, even in the
50s. But I came out here in 1960, Antonio, to see my hero, John Kennedy, get nominated. And it was a wonderful event and a great nomination. But I couldn't wait to get out of town, because it was like living in a toxic stew. And it was obvious even then, folks, that the freeways weren't working. Obvious even then. And of course, I looked around for a public transportation system, and it was disappearing. But I raced back to Boston, which, by the way, like every other major metropolitan area in the country, had been told that in order to solve our congestion problem, we had to build a California-style freeway system in, on, and over the city. And that visit here, combined with a visit to Stockholm, speaking of Stockholm, when I was back moderating the Advocates on public television, only a few of you are old enough to remember those days, when we did a couple of shows with Swedish television, Frank, in Stockholm. And I found myself in a city which wasn't crisscrossed by 8-lane expressways, was beautiful, had a terrific public transportation system, and worked. And so between Los Angeles in 1960 and Stockholm in 1973, I went back to Boston and was one of the leaders in the fight to kill the Master Highway Plan, the so-called Master Highway Plan, and to take that money, thanks to a sainted man named Thomas P. O'Neill, Jr., we were the first state in the country to be able to use our interstate highway money for public transportation. I got elected governor, and we had about $3 billion to spend on public transportation. And I think it's fair to say today that Boston's success as a city has more to do with that decision and what we did with it than any other single thing that happened. And today, as any of you know, at least for those of us who ride the MBTA all the time, most of us do, a minute and a half a day, there is no congestion. We go where we want to go, and if you're as old as I am, you do it with a senior pass for 65 cents.
I want to thank all of you for spending the time with us here today. Check with us electronically. We will continue to have Rosenfield Forums. We'll be looking at the fall